Welcome back to the deep dive. Before we even get started today, I have a really specific request for you.
Yeah, we are definitely wading into waters that most mainstream outlets are, frankly, too terrified to touch.
Exactly. So if you value this kind of unfiltered analysis, where we look at the arguments the algorithm usually suppresses, please hit that like and subscribe button right now.
It really helps us keep the lights on.
It does, and it signals that there is still an appetite for hard-hitting truth. So today's topic is, well, let's just say it's not for the faint of heart.
No, it's not. We aren't just reviewing a book today. We are examining a text that the author describes not as a manuscript, but as an actual weapon.
That line in the preface grabbed me immediately. We are doing a deep dive into an ebook called Institutional Indoctrination, Cultural Marxist Capture of the Pillars of Western Civilization by Conrad Riker.
It's a heavy title, but Riker isn't pulling any punches here.
Not at all. He explicitly calls this a manual for men who feel a sense of, I think he calls it a quiet betrayal in modern society.
Right, a quiet betrayal. And it is a dense read, incredibly packed with data. His central thesis is basically a complete inversion of the standard cultural narrative.
Because we are raised to believe we live in a patriarchy, right? A system run by men for men.
Exactly. But Riker argues that the West has actually transitioned into what he terms a gynocracy.
A gynocracy. Let's define that right up front because that is going to trigger a lot of people. What exactly does he mean when he uses that term?
He defines a gynocracy as a socio-political system that is designed specifically to extract resources from men while simultaneously demonizing their masculinity.
So he's saying the institutions we trust haven't just naturally evolved over time.
No, he argues they have been captured. The courts, the education system, the media. He claims they've been taken over by feminist and Marxist ideologies that view inherent male nature as a pathology, something to be cured.
So for the guy listening right now who feels like the system is rigged against him or who is just tired of constantly apologizing for being a man, Riker is essentially mapping out the why and the how of that feeling.
Yeah, he frames the entire book as a red pill journey. It's a guide to understanding the history of our institutions before they were captured.
It really is a manual for seeing the Matrix. And look, before we get into the heavy stats, if you want to follow along or support the author directly, you need to check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books right now to buy the book.
He definitely wants this information in your hands, not just in your ears.
And you can follow him at Conrad Riker on Substack for his ongoing analysis. But let's start with the first pillar he dismantles in the book, which is the workplace.
Right, because the mainstream narrative is entirely focused on the glass ceiling.
The barrier stopping women from reaching the top.
Exactly. But Riker says we are looking in the completely wrong direction. He argues we actually need to look down, and he introduces this concept of the glass cellar.
The glass cellar! That is such a vivid image. What exactly is in the cellar?
The men who keep civilization alive. Riker points out that while the media obsesses over the lack of female Fortune 500 CEOs, there is total, deafening silence about the bottom of the economy.
And he backs this up with a staggering statistic.
He does. He notes that men account for 93% of workplace fatalities.
93%.
Yes. We are talking about the coal miners, the deep-sea oil rig workers, the high-voltage linemen, the sewage maintenance crews.
The dangerous jobs.
The deadly jobs. Riker actually calls men the sacrificial engine of civilization. His argument is that men are the physical infrastructure.
We're expected to do the dirty and dangerous work quietly.
Quietly, yes, so that the rest of society, specifically women and children, can live in absolute safety and comfort.
It's this idea that male safety is entirely secondary to societal function. And he backs this up with a study that I found genuinely disturbing to read.
You're talking the Harvard CPR study.
Yeah, the Public Safety and Empathy study. This is a crucial piece of evidence for his argument about male disposability.
The study found that people are 37% less likely to perform CPR on a man in public compared to a woman.
37% less likely to save a man's life. Is that just a biological preference, or what is going on there?
Riker argues it is heavily conditioned fear. In the era of Me Too and constant litigation, people are terrified of touching a stranger.
Right.
But specifically, they are terrified of the legal or social repercussions of touching a woman, unless it's life or death. But for men, he argues the hesitation comes from a profound lack of empathy. We see a man down, and society assumes he can handle it, or worse, that he's a threat.
That ties right into his concept of the double standard of utility. This was a massive light bulb moment for me while reading the text.
It is the ultimate paradox of modern masculinity. Riker points out that traits like stoicism, competitiveness, aggression, and dominance are labeled toxic in a modern HR meeting.
Or a university classroom, you get sent to sensitivity training for displaying them.
Exactly. But those exact same traits are suddenly labeled heroic when a building is on fire, or when there's a war that needs to be fought.
So society basically wants men to be soft and compliant right up until the exact moment physical danger arrives.
Precisely. Then suddenly they demand you be dangerous. Riker argues you cannot pathologize the very instincts that keep society safe, and then expect those instincts to just magically be there when you dial 911.
He heavily contrasts this narrative of male privilege with the reality of the draft. I mean, selective service is still male only.
And he brings up the suicide epidemic to further dismantle the privileged lie.
The numbers there are just heartbreaking.
They really are. Riker cites that 80% of all suicides are men. He posits that if 80% of suicides were women, or any specific minority group, the government would declare a national state of emergency tomorrow.
There would be billions in funding.
Endless funding.
Yeah.
But because it is men, it's met with absolute silence. Or worse, the victims are blamed for not opening up enough or talking about their feelings.
Which leads us directly to the root cause of all this. Riker argues this conditioning doesn't start in the corporate office, it starts in the classroom. Let's get into the segment he calls the war on boys.
This section is going to infuriate a lot of parents who are listening. Riker's assessment is that the modern education system has been engineered from the ground up to view normal male behavior as a disease.
Because schools are essentially designed for female learning styles.
Right, sitting still, verbal communication, compliance, and he argues they are actively hostile to male learning styles, which are often spatial, highly competitive, and kinetic.
And if a boy doesn't naturally fit into that female mold,
He gets drugged. Riker calls it the Ritalin epidemic. He notes the data showing that boys are prescribed Ritalin at triple the rate of girls.
triple the rate.
Yes, and he argues this isn't about treating a legitimate medical disorder in most of these cases. It is about chemical restraint. It's about forcing active boys to be docile.
He uses the example of the Pop-Tart gun. It sounds funny at first, but the implications are actually quite dark.
It's completely ridiculous, but it happened. A young boy chews a breakfast pastry into the vague shape of a gun and gets suspended from school.
A zero-tolerance policy for basic male play.
Right. And Riker contrasts this exact scenario with how girls' aggression is treated. When girls engage in social exclusion or reputation destruction, which is a form of psychological violence, schools often just frame it as complex social development.
But a boy making a pew-pew noise with a piece of food is treated like a literal security threat.
Exactly. And it's not just the behavioral policing, it's the academic content itself. Riker talks about these ideological exorcisms happening in the curriculum.
This is the cultural Marxist capture he refers to in the book's title.
Yes. He details how history and literature are being actively rewritten to shame boys. He cites real examples of universities labeling Shakespeare as heteronormative dominance, or banning common phrases like thinking outside the box because they supposedly evoke colonial expansion.
It sounds like pure satire, but he is citing actual university guidelines.
He is bringing the receipts, and his overarching point is that the goal is to make young boys deeply ashamed of their own history and their natural instinct.
And the result of all this indoctrination.
Men are just checking out. Male college enrollment is currently in freefall. They are voting with their feet because the environment is openly hostile to their very existence. And the ones who do stay are forced into toxic masculinity workshops funded by tax dollars.
So let's say you survive the education system without being drugged, and you survive the dangerous workplace without dying. You want to build a normal life. You want a family. This is where Riker takes us into what he calls the marriage plantation.
This is arguably the most legally dense part of the entire book. Riker describes modern marriage not as a romantic partnership, but as a high-risk financial contract where the man holds all the liability and the state holds all the power.
He calls men in this system ATMs with legs.
It is a brutal description, but again, he backs it up with data. He highlights that 70% of divorces are initiated by women.
70%. Yet men are the ones paying 97% of the alimony.
Exactly. They lose the assets, they pay the alimony. But where he really digs into the legal capture is dismantling the deadbeat dad myth.
We see that trope everywhere in the culture. The guy who runs off and leaves his family totally destitute. Riker says that narrative is largely a fabrication.
He argues it is a convenient cover for a deeply corrupt system. He points to countless fathers who are desperate to see their kids, but are legally blocked by the family courts, yet are still forced to pay exorbitant fees. He specifically details the mechanics of the Bradley Amendment.
This is the U.S. legislation that prevents the retroactive reduction of child support, right?
Yes, and let's make sure you fully understand how insidious this is. If you lose your job today and genuinely cannot pay your child support, that debt accumulates.
Even if you have zero income.
Right. Even if you are unemployed for a full year, you cannot go back to a judge later and say, I had no income during that time. Please adjust the debt to reflect reality. No, it piles up with interest.
And if you can't pay it.
Riker shares documented stories of men who were literally incarcerated in modern-day debtors' prisons because they lost their jobs and couldn't pay the state.
There was one specific case in the book that honestly terrified me. The paternity fraud case down in Florida.
That case is the perfect example of what Riker flat out calls legalized slavery. A man was forced by the court to pay child support for a child that DNA evidence conclusively proved was not biologically his.
How does a judge even justify that legally?
The legal reasoning used was that because he had been, quote-unquote, acting like a father during the marriage, he assumed the permanent financial liability.
That is insane.
Riker uses this to prove his point, that in the eyes of the gynocracy, fatherhood is not a biological reality. It's not a spiritual bond. It is strictly a financial obligation owed to the state.
And the primary tool they use to enforce the sudden separation and financial extraction is the restraining order.
What he calls the silver bullet. Riker explains how ex parte restraining orders are weaponized in almost every modern divorce.
Ex parte meaning the accused doesn't even have to be in the room.
Exactly. A woman can file a claim saying she simply feels unsafe. No police report is needed. No physical evidence of abuse is required. And the man is instantly kicked out of his own home and legally barred from seeing his children.
Before a trial even begins, before he can even defend himself.
Yes, and that sets the new status quo. By the time the actual divorce trial happens months later, the kids have been living exclusively with the mother. The dad is living in a motel paying child support.
Yeah.
So primary custody naturally defaults to the mother.
Because it's established routine.
Right. Riker calls it a tactical nuke, used to secure custody and assets without any due process whatsoever.
It's a completely rigged game, but Riker argues this legal rigging wouldn't be possible without a massive cultural smear campaign to make society hate men. Which brings us to the media segment.
If you have watched a single sitcom or commercial in the last 30 years, you know the trope he's talking about. The bumbling dad.
Oh yeah, the guy who can't figure out how to operate a washing machine or a microwave.
Right. He is portrayed as an incompetent, overgrown man-child, and the wife is the long-suffering, hyper-competent saint who keeps the whole family alive.
And Riker argues this isn't just lazy Hollywood writing.
He says it is deliberate propaganda. He points specifically at Disney's role in this. He notes a very clear pattern where fathers in these movies are either completely dead, entirely missing, or they are the villain.
To erode the concept of paternal necessity.
Exactly, to push the idea that fathers aren't actually needed for a family to function.
It's fascinating because he contrasts this bumbling dad fiction with the physical reality of the men who built the world we are literally sitting in right now.
The erasure of male heroism. This is one of the most powerful sections of the text. Riker lists the high scalers who dangled from thin ropes over cliffs to build the Hoover Dam.
The men who died blasting through solid granite for the Transcontinental Railroad.
Yes. These were hyper-competent, brave, dangerous men who sacrificed themselves to build civilization. But the mainstream media completely ignores their sacrifice.
Instead, we get these intersectional narratives that frame all male achievement purely as oppression.
And he says this constant censorship and smearing is actually what is fueling the rise of the manosphere.
He calls it the Andrew Tate effect.
Right. Riker argues that heavy-handed censorship is the absolute best marketing tool for the Red Pill movement. When you ban male voices, when you tell young men they are fundamentally toxic just for wanting to be strong or competitive, you don't turn them into compliant feminists.
You just drive them to alternative platforms like Rumble.
You drive them underground. He argues that the mainstream media is actively radicalizing a whole generation of men simply by refusing to let them speak their truth in the public square.
So we have a captured legal system that views you as an ATM, a hostile education system that drugs you, and a media apparatus that fundamentally hates you. It paints an incredibly bleak picture. But Riker doesn't just complain about the problem.
No, he doesn't.
He offers a concrete strategy. What is the solution he proposes?
He calls it the red pill economy. And his primary advice is pretty stark. He calls it wealth without women.
That sounds extreme to a lot of people. Is he saying men should just become monks or hermits?
Not hermits, no. But he advocates for strategic isolationism regarding the state. He advises men to avoid legal marriage entirely.
Because of the asymmetric risk.
Exactly. He views the state marriage contract as a terrible business deal where the other party is actually financially incentivized by the government to break the contract for profit.
So he suggests keeping finances completely separate and focusing on building independent skills, which links directly to his thoughts on the FIRE movement, right?
Yeah.
Financial independence, retire early.
Yes, but with a red pill twist. Riker sees the FIRE movement not just as a way to retire to a beach somewhere, but as an escape mechanism.
An escape from what?
Escape from the corporate wife, which is his term for modern HR departments,
Yeah?
and escape from the marriage plantation. He argues that if you have FU money, you cannot be socially or financially coerced.
You don't have to sit through the toxic masculinity seminar at work apologizing for yourself because you literally don't need their paycheck.
Right, it buys you sovereignty. But beyond money, he also talks heavily about the importance of brotherhood.
This was a key takeaway. He argues that men are starving for true male-only spaces.
He mentions the men's sheds movement taking off in the UK and Australia, hardcore underground gyms, and even crypto communities.
He views these as modern sanctuaries.
Places where men can actually speak freely, share resources, and engage in unpoliced conversation without fear of being reported to HR or canceled.
And then, toward the end, he takes a turn I really didn't expect from a book like this. He starts talking deeply about religion.
I found that fascinating as well. He mounts a surprising defense of religious ritual, specifically bringing up the Orthodox Jewish minyan.
Why that specific ritual?
Because a minyan strictly requires a quorum of 10 men to conduct public prayer. It legally enforces community, structure, and accountability among men.
And he contrasts this ancient ritual with modern secular therapy.
Heavily. Riker argues that modern therapy often tries to feminize men. It asks them to sit on a couch and endlessly process their feelings, which he claims runs counter to actual male nature.
So he prefers the structured ritual over the therapy couch.
He does, because religious ritual provides discipline and a duty to something higher than yourself. He argues that men thrive on duty, physical action, and hierarchy, not just talking about emotions. He believes restoring that rigid male structure is the only way to combat the chaos of a gynocentric world.
It's a call for order in a world he sees as entirely disordered. So, to wrap this deep dive up, institutional indoctrination isn't just a critique of the modern West. It's a call to action for the men living in it.
It is absolutely a battle cry. Riker is telling men to stop apologizing for their mere existence. He wants you to deeply understand the game, the hidden legal, cultural, and financial rules, so you can finally stop being played by them.
And he leaves us with a final challenge that really sums up the entire ethos of the book.
He does. He challenges the reader directly. He says, civilization was built by men, on high steel, in deep suffocating mines, and in freezing trenches. You don't get to despise masculinity while relying every single day on the safety, the electricity, and the massive surplus that masculinity provides.
It's a demand for gratitude, or at the very least, a ceasefire. Which leads me to a thought that I haven't been able to shake since reading this. If the gynocracy continues to penalize the very nature required to maintain the physical world, if they keep drugging the active boys and punishing the stoic men, what happens in a generation when the power grid fails or the bridges start to crumble and there are simply no men left who are willing to step up and fix them? If men fully opt out, who keeps the lights on?
That is the existential question Riker is forcing society to face.
It really is. Look, for those of you listening, if this deep dive sparked something in you, whether it's anger, validation, or just intense curiosity, you owe it to yourself to read the source material. Don't just take our word for it.
Absolutely not. You need to go to Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books right now. Search for Institutional Indoctrination, Cultural Marxist Capture of the Pillars of Western Civilization by Conrad Riker. Buy the ebook, read it, and look at the data for yourself.
And to keep up with his latest writings and ongoing analysis, make sure you go follow @ConradRiker at Substack.
It is definitely worth a follow.
Thanks for listening to the deep dive today. And one last time, if you want us to keep bringing you these kinds of unfiltered, hard-hitting topics that challenge the mainstream narrative, please like and subscribe. It makes a huge difference for us. We'll see you next time.